Than it is today. They're basically saying that the velocity of light was about a factor of 1,000,000 times faster for Adam and Eve than it was for us today. And Barry Setterfield, he's an Australian, and by the way, he does not even have a bachelor's degree. So, and one of the things I try to do when I debate people is make sure that they're at an academic level where they actually understand the arguments. But I did respond to Barry. He sent me an email, I sent him one back. But the email he sent back to me clearly told me he doesn't even understand the basics of physics. So that was disappointing. But here's the simple thing. Everywhere you go in the world, everybody knows one equation. They don't know F equals ma, but they know E equals mc squared. Okay, C is the velocity of light, m is mass, E is energy. If the velocity of light was a factor of 1,000,000 times faster for Adam, what does that do for the energy coming out of the sun? It makes the heat of the sun 1 trillion times hotter. So,
in the article, it says that the mass actually is reduced.
yeah, I understand what Barry is doing. What Barry is doing is disingenuous in the sense that he's actually taking constants from somewhere else, changing those in order to try to fix up E equals mc squared, not realizing what he's done with the other constants is catastrophic for life. And by the way, we astronomers can measure the velocity of light in distant stars and galaxies. I tried to explain that to Barry. The fact is that you're going to see these hyperfine split spectral lines. The degree of splitting tells you what the velocity of light was when that light left the star or the galaxy. Okay, as we look at galaxies 13 billion light years away, the velocity of light is identical to what we measure here on Earth. Also, Barry misunderstood the data that goes back 300 years. Pardon me? Okay, Barry was referring, okay, excuse me. Yes, okay. You can read A Matter of Days. By the way, the vast majority of young Earth creationists have abandoned that argument because they realize it's not a good argument. And what I explain in A Matter of Days is multiple lines of reasoning why the velocity of light must be constant. And it's part of the anthropic principle. Any change in the velocity of light destroys the possibility of life existing. So the very fact that you ask the question is proof that the velocity of light has not changed throughout cosmic history. And let me end with this. The Bible itself tells us the constants of physics don't change. 7 places in the Bible we're told, I'll talk about this tomorrow, that what God says, for example, in Jeremiah 33, you Jews change, I don't change. I never change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change. And there's 6 other places in the Bible which make the statement, the laws of physics were established by God at the beginning of the universe, and they remain fixed and unchanged until the full number of human beings has been redeemed. Why? Those laws of physics are critical to bring about the redemption of billions of human beings. The whole universe was created to bring about the possibility of the existence of billions of human beings who could be redeemed. That's a theme I bring out in why the universe is the way it is, and you'll see citations there establishing why there can't be a change in the velocity of light. I'm about 2 minutes over time. Thank you. But I came here with this talk, More Than Myth, Can Genesis Be Harmonized with Science? Now, at Reasons to Believe, our team of scientists and theologians, we do a lot of debates with atheists and skeptics. But something we've noticed when we debate the academic skeptics is their response. For example, my colleague Fazal Rana, he's our staff biochemist, he debated Michael Roos at the University of California, Riverside on the subject of the origin of life. And when Michael Roos had his opportunity to rebut Fuzz's arguments for why the origin of life must be supernatural, I noticed that Michael totally ignored everything Fuzz had to say. Instead, he went straight to Genesis 1. and tried to turn the debate into whether or not Genesis 1 was scientifically credible. Now, some of you may recognize this fellow, Michael Shermer. He's been here to Austin. He's the executive director of the Skeptic Society. And, I pastor in a church that's just a few miles from the headquarters of the Skeptic Society. We get atheists coming to the class I teach on a regular basis. And I've debated him many times. And it doesn't matter what I debate with Michael Shermer, whatever the subject is, he always goes straight to Genesis 1. So, for example, Fuzz Rana and I debated him at the University of Texas right here in Austin. Over 3,000 people showed up for the debate. And Michael Shermer's job was to respond to the presentations Fuzz and I gave on the scientific evidence for the God of the Bible. He ignored everything we said and spent his entire 30 minutes bashing Genesis chapter 1. Okay. And this has happened every time I debate with Michael. Doesn't matter what the debate topic is, he always goes straight for Genesis 1. Now, why do leading atheists, professional atheists, do this? It's because they see Genesis 1 as the Achilles heel of the Christian faith. Their object is to destroy the faith that people have in God's Word. And they see Genesis 1 as the most effective way to do that. In fact, these atheists and skeptics have been so effective in using Genesis 1 as a weapon that they've intimidated the Christian community. Now, I speak a lot in front of pastors, but what I find out is that most pastors will not touch the first 11 chapters of Genesis. They avoid it because they're trying to avoid these attacks from skeptics and atheists. However, many theologians still teach on Genesis 1, but as I speak on seminary campuses, what I'm noticing is that theology professors are now taking this approach, where they say, yes, we will teach on Genesis 1, but for example, I have this quote. We need to understand that Genesis 1 is saying nothing about creation or science. Genesis 1 ought not to be taken as a literal historical account of all material reality. And that's how they're responding to these skeptics. They say, wait a minute, you're saying that Genesis 1 is scientific nonsense, but we're telling you there is no science in Genesis 1. There is no creation in Genesis 1. This is not a chronology. It's an allegory or a figure of speech. However, if you take a Bible and open it up to the first page and show it to someone who's really never been exposed to the Bible before and say, what do you think of this? It screams that it's an historical account of natural history. I mean, look at the great ends the author of Genesis 1 went to. The days are numbered. It uses the phrase, and it was so. It's like, if you know anything about the Hebrew language, Moses couldn't have gone any further to communicate with great clarity that this indeed is an account of creation history. And by the way, things are happening at the seminary level where I see theologians saying we need to change the lexicons. The word bara does not mean create. The word asa does not mean make. For 19 centuries, the dictionaries have been wrong. All an attempt to try to respond to these atheists and skeptics who are saying Genesis 1 is nothing but scientific nonsense. Now, I speak a lot in Genesis 1. I've written books on Genesis 1 and the other early chapters of Genesis. People have asked me, why do you do this when this is such a thorn and such a problem with these atheists and skeptics? Well, for me personally, I was not raised in a Christian home. In fact, I really didn't get to know Christians to any degree until 8 years after I became a Christian. But it was Genesis 1 that was a turning point for me in recognizing that the Bible indeed was the error-free word. It's the first thing I read in the Bible. And I came to a very different conclusion than these atheists and skeptics. Now, what I'm going to show you is how you can read Genesis 1 without any hermeneutical gymnastics and show that this indeed must be the inspired, inerrant Word of God. So that's my goal here in these next few minutes, to transform Genesis 1 from Christianity's Achilles heel, our so-called greatest weakness, into one of the strongest reasons to believe the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. And we're going to do this through applying the scientific method to the text. And they said, why are you doing that? Well, the first time I picked up a Bible and began to go through Genesis 1, I saw the scientific method. Now, I had been trained and educated in Canada. I was raised in the public education system. I was taught the scientific method in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. We got it every single year. But none of my public school teachers told me where the scientific method came from. When I first looked at Genesis 1, the scientific method leapt off the page. As I looked at the other creation texts in the Bible, and there's over 24 of them, they all follow the scientific method, which caused me to do some historical reading, and I recognized that the scientific method was derived from the Bible. That's where it came from. So I prefer to call it the biblical testing method. What attracted me about the Bible was the only holy book that I had picked up that commanded objective testing. The Apostle Paul in Thessalonians says it this way, test everything, hold fast to that which is good. But the Bible not only commanded objective testing, it showed you step by step how to put everything to the test. And that was the birth of the scientific method. What happened in the Reformation, ordinary people, not just the pastors, began to read the Bible for themselves. And those with a scientific bent saw this biblical testing method. They applied it to their scientific research, and that was the birth of the scientific revolution. It's no accident that the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. It's right there in the Bible. Now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I'm hoping to leave a little bit of time for Q&A after I'm done. And you're going to think, wow. In fact, Richard Land was saying this is kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. I'm going to give this to you quickly, but the statements I'm making are all backed up by full-length books, and I'll refer to them briefly as we go through this. So it will be, if you want to go through this slowly and absorb it, we have resources to make that possible. So with that, let me just jump into it. Genesis 1:1, probably the best known verse in the whole world. As I travel and speak around the world, I run into people who've never heard of John 3:16, but everybody's heard of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, in the debates I've had with Michael Shermer, he says, the Bible gets it wrong from the very first verse. It says the heavens and the earth are created at the same time. What he doesn't realize is that in Hebrew, there is no word for universe. Instead, you got this phrase, Shamayana rests with a definite article. Whenever you see in the Bible, the heavens and the earth, it's referring to the totality of physical reality. It's used 9 times in the Old Testament, but it always means the totality of physical reality, all matter, all energy, and all space and time. And the word bara, translated create, means to bring into existence something brand new that never existed before. And this is repeated many times as you go through the creation texts in the Bible, that the whole universe has a beginning, not just a beginning of matter and energy, but the beginning of space and time itself. Now, I'm well aware that within the church there's a lot of controversy on how to interpret these creation texts. Let me give you a key. 2 Thessalonians, 1:9. Pardon me, 2 Timothy 1:9. The grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time. Titus 1:2. The hope that we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. Every major creation text in the Bible, all 24 of them, always link the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of redemption. God's works of redemption precede his works of creation. Before God created the universe, he was already putting into effect his works of redemption. The key to interpreting these creation texts is to always put it in the context of redemption. Or to put it another way, everything God creates is for the purpose of redeeming billions of human beings. You get that in Revelation 7:9, that the hosts that will be standing before the Lord, the redeemed hosts, will be countless. The Greeks could count up to 1 billion. Countless means there's billions that will be redeemed. And there's a reason why God designed the universe, so that our planet would be able to sustain billions of human beings at one time. He wants to redeem a large number of us. And so this is how I think we should go through the different creation texts of the Bible, interpret it in the context of redemption. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I was reading this as a teenager when physicists in Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. I won't go into those theorems. There's about 30 of them today. But the latest of the theorems, published just a few years ago, makes the point that if the universe contains mass, and I'll be talking about this in a little more detail tomorrow, every one of you is living proof that the universe contains mass. And if the universe is governed by the equations of general relativity, today general relativity ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics. Some of you are probably aware of the discovery of gravity waves about 5 weeks ago. There is no theory that's been better proven, which means that the theorems based on general relativity and the universe containing mass must be true. What do those theorems state? That there must be a causal agent beyond space and time that created the entire universe. Because of these space-time theorems, we know that a God that transcends space and time is responsible for bringing everything into existence. Now, this is not just something that's acknowledged by those of us in astronomy and physics that are Bible-believing Christians. It's also acknowledged by the very physicists that produce these theorems. So, for example, Alexander Vilenkin, one of the 3 authors of the latest of these theorems, wrote this in a book about a year after. He said, quote, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." And what is that problem? Proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who created our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. Which means a miracle-working God must exist. We get all that from the very first sentence of the Bible. Great place to start with any skeptic. And this is something I've written about extensively in this book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is. And this is an outline of what I'm going to cover in the remainder of my talk. This basically says we move from Genesis 1:1 into the 6 days of creation. We need to first deal with step 1 of the biblical testing method. Step 1 is do not interpret until you establish the point of view or the frame of reference. And it was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong frame of reference or the wrong point of view. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the definitions for the different words, because after all, this is a text written in Hebrew. Hebrew has a very tiny vocabulary, and virtually every Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions. Notice that when Christians debate these creation texts, they're basically English language speakers. In English, we have 4 million words in our language. It's an enormous vocabulary. Biblical Hebrew, if you don't count the names of people and cities, is just 3,000 words. So anyway, we'll get into that, and then we're going to examine how accurately does the Genesis 1 text describe the order of events and the description of the events. So let's begin with the first one. What we need to notice here is that the frame of reference changes from the universe as a whole, Genesis 1:1, to the surface of the earth. Genesis 1:2, the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. That's the frame of reference from which we're to interpret the 6 days of creation. When skeptics and atheists say that Genesis 1 teaches scientific nonsense, it's because they have the point of view above the earth, as if God is looking down on the earth and telling us what he did. I would agree with them. If that is the point of view, Genesis 1 is teaching 100% scientific nonsense. And this would be proof that the Bible could not be the inspired, inerrant Word of God. But they got the wrong frame of reference. If you have the frame of reference on the surface of the earth, it transforms, as you'll see in a few minutes, Genesis 1 from scientific nonsense into one of the most powerful arguments we have that the Bible is the inspired, authoritative, inerrant Word of God. So if you remember nothing else from my talk today, I want you to remember that the point of view for Genesis 1 is the surface of the waters of the earth, below the cloud layer, not above the cloud layer, on the surface of the waters. Now, step 2 of the biblical testing method is to establish the starting conditions. But before I go there, I want to deal with the elephant in the room. What do you do with this word yom that's translated day? I mean, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a raging debate. Are these creation days 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, or are they 6 consecutive longer periods of time? I wasn't even aware of that debate when I first picked up a Bible. That's one thing I did recognize. Just looking at the first page of the Bible, this word day must have at least 3 distinct definitions. Why? Creation day 1, it contrasts days and nights. That's day referring to the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it contrasts seasons, days, and years. That's day as 24 hours. And Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day being used for a long but finite period of time. Now, if you actually pick up a Hebrew lexicon, you discover that it has these 4 distinct definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, but a long but finite period of time. And in English, we have over a dozen different words for an epoch of time. In biblical Hebrew, the only word you've got for an epoch of time is this word yom. It's the only biblical word that can be used for a long but finite period of time. Now, when I was 17, reading the Bible for the first time, what I noticed was that you got an evening and a morning bracketing the first 6 creation days, which told me each one had a start point and an end point. I was expecting to find an evening and a morning for the 7th day, but I didn't find it. It's not there in the text. I said, well, maybe we're still in the 7th day. Now, a little bit about my story. I became addicted to astronomy and physics when I was about 7 years of age. That's when I was bringing about 5 books home from the Vancouver Public Library and taking another 5 the next week. And my parents became concerned about my addiction. So when I was about 9.5, 10 years of age, they bought me this really thick book on evolutionary biology. And I was the only one in my family that read it. But after I read it, I said to my mother and father, Mom and Dad, the numbers don't add up. We have all this speciation before humanity and very little after humanity. And that bothered me ever since I was 9.5 years of age. And it wasn't until I was 17 that that enigma got resolved. And it got resolved by reading Genesis 1. For 6 days, God creates. That explains all the speciation before humanity. On the 7th day, God stops creating. That explains why we're not seeing it in the present era. And what is God doing during the 7th day? He's redeeming billions of human beings. During the 6 days, he sets up all the resources that are going to be needed for billions of human beings to be redeemed. But at the end of the 6th day, he stops his physical creation, and then on the 7th day, there's going to be the redemption. And by the way, the 7th day will end. We hear about that in Romans chapter 8, how there will come a time when the full number of human beings that God intends to redeem will be redeemed. Then the universe will have fulfilled its purpose, and God will replace his universe with all of its physics, with all of its 200 billion plus galaxies, with a brand new realm, the new creation we see in in Revelation 21 and 22. But hey, if you want to look at 21 more biblical reasons why these creation days must be long periods of time, you can check out my latest book, A Matter of Days. Step 2 of the biblical testing method, do not interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. And notice that Genesis 1 tells us, in addition to the point of view that is dark on the surface of the waters, that the water covers the whole surface of the earth. There are no continents. And the world is formless and void. In what context? Well, the 6 days are talking about life. It's saying it's empty of life and it's unfit for life, but now the Spirit of God begins to perform his miracles. Now, this is certainly implied in Genesis 1:2. It's explicit in a parallel account. And what's wonderful about the Bible, it's not just one book, it's 66 books. And there's 3 other texts in the Old Testament that also take you through the 6 days of creation. Psalm 104, Proverbs 8, and Job 37, 38, and 39. And I encourage everyone, in terms of trying to resolve divisions within the church, at least look at those 4 different texts. What you'll see in Job 38, when it refers to creation day 1, and what's going on before creation day 1, God speaks and he says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. The reason why it's dark is not because of the lack of light in the universe. It's dark because God had wrapped the oceans with clouds that kept the light of the universe from reaching the surface of the earth. Now, this is clarified when you look at creation day 1. What does it say in creation day 1? Let there be light. It uses the verb haya. It does not use the word for create or make. God did not create life on day 1 or make life on day 1. He let the light be because he already created it when he created the universe. That was Genesis 1:1. But light reaches the surface of the earth for the first time on creation day 1. This is when God transforms our atmosphere from being opaque to translucent. As an astronomer, I can tell you the primordial earth began with an atmosphere 100 times thicker than the atmosphere we have today. And that atmosphere indeed would not let any light get through. But God transformed the atmosphere. So now it's translucent. Light can reach the surface of the earth, but it's overcast. Okay, that's creation day 1. Creation day 2. It says, let there be water above and water below. Now, on seminary campuses, this is a huge subject of debate. Is the text speaking like the Babylonians talked about, a kind of a metal sphere over the earth with holes in it that water leaks through with stars painted on it? That's what the Babylonians believed. And a lot of people try to pin that on the biblical text. Notice it's just one sentence. But if you go to Job 37 and the first half of Job 38, that chapter and a half is all about creation day 2. So instead of getting stuck here with a single sentence in Genesis 1, you can go to the book of Job and you've got a chapter and a half. And what do you see in that chapter and a half? It goes into great detail about how God set up this wonderfully designed water cycle with multiple kinds of liquid precipitation and multiple kinds of frozen precipitation. Now, these are 6 that are mentioned. The Job text actually mentions more. But what I find significant about the different kinds of precipitation is talked about in the book of Job. We need each one for advanced civilization to be possible on planet Earth. We need each one in order for billions of human beings to be redeemed through the work of Jesus Christ. So when you celebrate Thanksgiving, you might want to thank God for the fact that you gave us a planet where we got hail, where we have snow, and where we've got frost and mist and dew and all the other forms of precipitation. And so back to creation day 2, water in the atmosphere above and water in the seas and rivers and lakes below, where it cycles through so we can have all these forms of precipitation that allow us to have global high technology civilization. Now, if you want a resource that takes you through this in detail, you can get our DVD, Journey Toward Creation. This is a television documentary we produced a few years ago, where basically I act as a travel guide, taking you on a journey from the surface of the earth to the very farthest reaches of the universe. And what's wonderful about that journey, you're going back in time. Because the farther away we astronomers look, the farther back in time we see, and we actually have telescopes so powerful we can take you back to the cosmic creation event itself. That's why we call it Journey Toward Creation. But in this DVD, we show you the miracle of creation day 1 and creation day 2. And this edition that you'll see out on the table, it's now available in 11 languages. and it's been shown on television in 5 different countries of the world, including Mongolia and Russia and China. And we even broadcast it into Iran in the Farsi language. Creation Day 3, let there be land masses. And this is when the text talks about God transforming the water world Earth, where all you have is water on the surface, to a planet where you got oceans and continents coexisting with one another. Now, I happen to be educated at a time when plate tectonics was an emerging science. Matter of fact, I got to take a geophysics course from 2 of the 3 geophysicists who launched the discipline of plate tectonics. But it's advanced to such a degree today that we now can calculate in great detail the growth of the continental land masses with respect to time. And so we're able to demonstrate that the Bible indeed got it right. Our Earth started off with no land at all. And then volcanic activity produced a few small islands, then the plate tectonics kicked in, and you began to see continents being built up. But as you look at this graph here, I want you to see that time when the continents are being most aggressively built up. Basically a little less than half the Earth's current age. Where does Genesis 1 put it? The first part of Creation Day 3. So notice Genesis times it the same way that our geophysicists have now determined is the history of the growth of the continental land masses. Creation Day 3, Part 2, let there be plants on these new continents. Let the land produce vegetation. Now, I remember when we were at the University of Texas with Michael Shermer, he made a statement, knowing that Fuzz and I would have no opportunity to respond, where he says Genesis 1 gets it dead wrong. It puts plants on the continents before animals show up in the oceans. The fossil record has it the opposite way. And I talked to many of the atheists and skeptics who were part of the audience afterwards and said, well, of course, animals have bones and shells. Their fossil records, their fossil remains are going to last a long time. Plants do not. They're going to decay, and we're not going to have that remaining evidence beyond more than a few 100 million years. But what has happened since that time is that papers have been published. This one by Knopf and Kennedy, which basically makes the point we can't find the fossils, but we can find the isotope evidence that shows us that plants were just as abundant on the continents for 200 million years previous to the first appearance of animals and the 200 million years thereafter. Then 2 years after that, a second paper got published where they said, we found the actual fossils of these ancient plants. A bit of an overstatement. What they found were fossil parts. The biggest part they found was 1 millimeter in diameter. But it was sufficient that they could now conclude that plants were abundant on the continents for 600 million years before the Cambrian explosion of animals showing up in the seas. So this is an example where, again, as it says in Job and Psalms, the more we study the book of nature, the more evidence we find for the handiwork of God, the supernatural handiwork of God. Creation Day 4, it says, let there be the great lights. Once again, it doesn't use the word for create or make. It says, let there be the great lights. And basically says why? Let there be the great lights so they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. Now, when I was reading this at age 17, I said, for whose benefit? And what you recognize is all the life after Day 4 is critically dependent on knowing the positions of the sun, moon, and stars to regulate their complex biological clocks. But all the life previous to Day 4 doesn't need to have that information. And so bacteria and fungi, for example, are quite happy if they never see where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But that doesn't work for birds and for mammals and for certain insects as well. And so this is when God transforms our atmosphere from being translucent, permanently overcast, to where it's now transparent at a sufficient amount of time that the creatures can actually regulate their biological clocks by the position of the sun, moon, and stars. And just in the past few months, geophysicists have discovered what was responsible for transforming our atmosphere from being permanently overcast to at least on occasion transparent. And it has to do with the great oxygenation events. where we have very little oxygen for the first 2.25 billion years of Earth's history. Then you got what's called the first great oxygenation event, but then it drops down to a low number, and then about 600 million years ago, it jumps from 1% up to 8%, then 10%, and up to the current 21%. And when it jumps from 1% to 8%, this is when the atmosphere transforms. That happened about 575 million years ago. It hit 10% 543 million years ago. But something else we find very fascinating in the fossil record, it fulfills what we see in Creation Day 5. Creation Day 5, it says, "Let the seas swarm with these sea creatures." The Avalon explosion 575 million years ago is when our planet suddenly transforms from microscopic life to creatures with body sizes as much as 2 meters across. Now, these are animals that don't have a skeleton, they don't have a digestive tract, they don't have a mouth or an anus, they don't have lungs or a heart, but they're literally 2 meters across. They can't exist unless there's at least 8% oxygen in the atmosphere. But what we notice is the moment we see this jump from 1% to 8%, these animals suddenly appear. They come out of nowhere. You go from bacteria and microscopic fungi to these big creatures. They just come suddenly upon the scene the moment oxygen hits 8%. Then there's an extinction event where they're all driven out of existence. And 1 million years later, we have the Cambrian explosion. Now oxygen's 10%. Now there's enough oxygen, you can have animals with shells and a skeleton with a digestive tract. And then this is the Cambrian explosion of animals. Creatures like these trilobites, for example. But once again, they come out of nowhere. They just suddenly appear upon the scene. Even atheist biologists like Richard Dawkins has written in their book that these creatures come into existence out of nowhere with no evolutionary history. Now, a few years ago, a very detailed review of the Cambrian explosion was written by Kevin Peterson in Bioessays. This is what he said: elucidating the materialistic basis, that is, the non-theistic basis for the Cambrian explosion, has become more elusive, not less, the more we learn about the event itself. The more we learn about the Avalon and Cambrian explosion, the more obvious it becomes. These are supernatural events. They can't happen without the handiwork of God. Creation Day 5, we see the second origin of life, which you see in Genesis 1 as 3 separate origins of life. The origin of physical life, Creation Day 1, the origin of soulish life, Creation Day 5. Here again, for the second time only, you see the word create. God created the universe. Now this is a second usage of the word bara, where it says God created the birds and the sea mammals. And it actually uses 2 verbs. It says God made them and he created them. Their bodies were not brand new. Other creatures had physical bodies. What was brand new, these are the first animals on the face of the earth endowed with mind, will, and emotions, and also endowed with a motivation to serve and please a higher species. We weren't here yet, but these animals were designed in advance to serve and please us human beings, and they were endowed with a capacity to form relationships with us. The book of Job says, look to the birds, they'll teach you. Look to the beasts of the field, they'll instruct you. Here's one instruction. As they were created to serve and please a higher species, we human beings were created to serve and please a higher being. As they were created to serve and please us, we were created to serve and please God. Creation Day 6. The Bible never talks about God creating the first land mammals. Instead, it jumps ahead and talks about God creating 3 categories of very advanced land mammals, the ones that are going to be crucial for launching human civilization. Now, there's a lot more on this in the book of Job. Job 38 and 39 go into this in detail. What you have here in Genesis chapter 1 is a single sentence. Keep in mind, Job predates the content of Genesis. And so Moses didn't have to go into great detail on this because Job had already laid this out for them. But these are the 3 categories. The short-legged land mammals. You say, what do we need those for civilization? Well, here's the problem with human beings. Our bodies are wonderfully designed for hot climates. They're terribly designed for cold climates. But thanks to these little rodents, notice that these are warm-blooded mammals with small body sizes. The only way they can maintain their body heat is to grow thick, luxuriant fur. And so early humans quickly exploited these creatures because one thing they learned, they like hanging around us. They don't mind being around thousands of their friends. And if we make pets out of them and take care of them, they'll provide us with all the clothing we need so we can move humanity into all the continental masses of the world. And two kinds of long-legged land mammals, those that are easy to tame, are reference to the herbivores. And you'll see these mentioned in the book of Job, how God gave us these long-legged herbivores to launch agricultural industry. And then the long-legged creatures that are difficult to tame are reference to the carnivores that he created so that we could have companions and household pets. I mean, that's what we do, right? You don't really try to make a pet cow and bring him into your living room. You quickly discover you can't housebreak that cow, and there'll be consequences. However, you can bring a carnivore in. They're more difficult to tame, but they make wonderful companions. Again, the principle, some to serve, others to please. And likewise, we have that responsibility in relating to God. If you want to read more about these advanced animals, I've written a book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, where I take you in detail through Job 37, 38, and 39. But there's a lesson of humility there. We think we humans launch civilization all by ourselves. What we see in Genesis and Job, we would have never launched civilization if God hadn't given these animals mentioned on Creation Day 6. We'd be nowhere. We know that because when people moved into Australia, they wiped out the animals that are mentioned in the book of Job that lived there. And notice the Aborigines were stuck in the Stone Age at a low population level until Europeans and Americans came and brought the animals that they had killed off thousands of years ago. And then it ends with the third use of the word create, referring to human beings. We're different from all other life forms. We're not just physical, we're not just soulish, we are spiritual. We're the only species that has the spiritual capacity to be able to relate to God himself. We're the only ones that engage in philosophy. And so we're created in the image of God. Well, I saw this pattern way back when I was 17 years of age, before I'd become a Christian. But what I realized is, once you understand that this word yom, translated day, is an epoch of time, and the frame of reference for the 6 creation days is the surface of the earth, you get a perfect fit with the established scientific record for the history of earth and all of its life. The Bible gets a perfect score on the description and the placement of the initial conditions, and a perfect score on the order and the description of the events of creation that are mentioned. Seeing these results was a major factor in my signing my name in the back of a Gideon Bible at age 19, giving my life to Jesus Christ. It was also a huge factor when I first met my wife, Kathy. I met her at a Bible study, and the first thing she said to me was, "You're a Caltech astronomer and you're a Christian. What do you do with Genesis 1?" Now, she's not the only one. I get that all the time. And what I found out is that her brother, who was the youth leader in her church growing up, left the Christian faith because he thought Genesis 1 taught scientific nonsense. This is why it's important that every Christian be prepared to be able to defend the inerrancy and the inspiration of Genesis 1, because you're not going to get away with it. You can't avoid it. The non-Christians will put you on the spot. And by the way, you don't have to be an astronomer and a pastor like myself. What we've done at Reasons to Believe is to prepare this small group video teaching series. Basically, it's 8 20-minute DVDs that take you through the creation days one at a time. So you get to absorb it. And by the way, it's discussion-based. I do this in front of an audience of about 15 young people between 17 and 34, some of them Christians, brand new Christians, others non-Christians. You get to see the impact of what happens to the audience of 15 as they go through these 8 segments. And it's a great way to get discussion going. It's a great way to get yourself equipped to be able to defend Genesis chapter 1. And in closing, I would say, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. And if you read this in the Greek, when it talks about reason, it's talking about the reasons that people need that you're talking to. And then do this with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience, because people listen more clearly to your demeanor than they do your words. But just a quick story in closing. I was in an airport waiting for a flight, and my wife called me, and we're working on a 5th edition of a little booklet called Genesis 1, A Scientific Perspective. A gentleman about 20 feet away heard a little bit of the phone conversation, and after I put down the phone, he came over to me and said, "Were you talking about Genesis 1? And I said, "Yes." And he says, "You seem to think it's actually true." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm a computer scientist. I'm a professor at Stanford. What makes you think that this is scientifically correct?" And I said, "Well, I'm an astronomer, and I was on the faculty at Caltech." And he says, "I got a lot of questions for you." We got on the plane. He had a first-class seat at the front. We were in the very back of the plane. But once the stewardess said it was okay, he got up out of his first-class seat, walked all the way to the back of the plane, and he stood there for the entire flight talking to us about Genesis 1. He wouldn't leave us alone. We walked a baggage claim. The conversation kept going. He picked up his bags. He still wanted to talk. We exchanged business cards, and the conversation's been continuing. There's something impactful when a non-Christian adult meets a Christian who actually believes Genesis 1 is scientifically true. And it's a demonstration of the inerrancy of the Bible. If you'll prepare these yourself, you're going to see God supernaturally bringing people across your path. Okay, I've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take these 2 minutes for any question that you care to ask. It doesn't have to be in this topic. And I'll try to repeat the question. Okay, yes.
You've been at this a long time now. How have you seen the generations, how do they change in their questions about this issue?
Well, what's happening, especially with young men, if you actually go to these atheist websites, they're really trying to draw in young single men. And I'm finding everywhere I travel, these young single men have become the disciples of the Richard Dawkins and the Michael Shermers of the world. But they haven't really looked at the Bible for themselves, and they haven't really talked to anybody who's taken the time to go through the text. They believe that what Michael Shermer says about Genesis has got to be correct. We have a great opportunity to say, you know what? You've been sold a bill of goods. Let's actually go through the text. And that's why we developed this DVD series. Basically, I don't answer all the questions. I get the audience started, and my goal is they would talk about it amongst themselves and make the discoveries themselves. What I've noticed, especially with the millennials, they don't want to be preached at. They want to make the discoveries themselves. So that's kind of the approach we take. Okay, I got time for one more question. Over here.
You were mentioned in an article at CMI called "The Speed of Light is Really Slowing Down."
Right.
And they said in the article that you ignored Barry Setterfield's response to your criticism.
Well, okay. I deal with this actually in my book, A Matter of Days. And yes, in the young earth creationist community, they try to claim that we can actually have light from distant galaxies reach the earth quickly, recognizing that the velocity of light might have been 1 million times faster, billions of light years out than it is today. They're basically saying that the velocity of light was about a factor of 1 million times faster for Adam and Eve than it was for us today. And Barry Setterfield, he's an Australian, and by the way, he does not even have a bachelor's degree. So, one of the things I try to do when I debate people is make sure that they're at an academic level where they actually understand the arguments. But I did respond to Barry. He sent me an email, I sent him one back, but the email he sent back to me clearly told me he doesn't even understand the basics of physics. So that was disappointing. But here's the simple thing. Everywhere you go in the world, everybody knows one equation. They don't know F equals ma, but they know E equals mc squared. Okay, c is the velocity of light, m is mass, E is energy. If the velocity of light was a factor of 1,000,000 times faster for atom, what does that do for the energy coming out of the sun? It makes the heat of the sun 1 trillion times hotter. So,
In the article, it says that the mass actually is reduced.
yeah, I understand what Barry is doing. What Barry is doing is disingenuous in the sense that he's actually taking constants from somewhere else, changing those in order to try to fix up E equals mc squared, not realizing what he's done with the other constants is catastrophic for life. And by the way, we astronomers can measure the velocity of light in distant stars and galaxies. I tried to explain that to Barry. The fact is that you're going to see these hyperfine split spectral lines. The degree of splitting tells you what the velocity of light was when that light left the star or the galaxy. Okay, as we look at galaxies 13 billion light years away, the velocity of light is identical to what we measure here on Earth. Also, Barry misunderstood the data that goes back 300 years. Pardon me? Okay, Barry was referring, okay, excuse me. Yes. Okay. You can read A Matter of Days. By the way, the vast majority of young Earth creationists have abandoned that argument because they realize it's not a good argument. And what I explain in A Matter of Days is multiple lines of reasoning why the velocity of light must be constant. And it's part of the anthropic principle. Any change in the velocity of light destroys the possibility of life existing. So the very fact that you ask the question is proof that the velocity of light has not changed throughout cosmic history. And let me end with this. The Bible itself tells us the constants of physics don't change. 7 places in the Bible we're told, I'll talk about this tomorrow, that what God says, for example, in Jeremiah 33, you Jews change, I don't change. I never change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change. And there are 6 other places in the Bible which make the statement, the laws of physics were established by God at the beginning of the universe, and they remain fixed and unchanged until the full number of human beings has been redeemed. Why? Those laws of physics are critical to bring about the redemption of billions of human beings. The whole universe was created to bring about the possibility of the existence of billions of human beings who could be redeemed. That's a theme I bring out in why the universe is the way it is, and you'll see citations there establishing why there can't be a change in the velocity of light. I'm about 2 minutes over time. Thank you.